朋友们，今天看到了一段印度学者的采访视频，非常的有意思。这个三哥呢，名叫 Kanti Bajippa， 是一个印度国际关系学者，专注于南亚的安全、印度外交政策以及中印关系等领域，拥有牛津大学国际关系博士的学位，而本科呢就读于普林斯顿大学，可以说是一个实打实的高印，拥有国际视野，知道外面正在发生什么。而他呢写了一本书，叫做《印度 vs 中国：为什么他们永远不可能成为朋友》。他的核心观点是因为中国远比印度要强大，两者的综合实力差距是7倍，所以呢，中国没有任何的理由来依照印度的想法行事。说直白点，就一句话：印度你算老几？凭什么要鸟你呢？而与此同时印度深知自己处于落后的弱势地位，所以在面对中国时必须要顶住，坚决不能退缩，否则就被人看穿了自己的脆弱。他的这个观点让我觉得非常的矛盾。中国是明显要比印度强大，所以不甩印度是合情合理的，结果反而被他们认为这样是不尊重印度。而印度呢，明明自己实力很弱，却要打肿脸充胖子，跟中国硬碰硬，在他们看来却又是理所应当的，越弱越要假装强大。你看他的这个认知是不是跟中国人截然相反？我们在国家弱小的时候，对外方针是什么样的策略呢？是韬光养晦，而不是打肿脸充胖子。你弱你就得承认，这是对于自我的一种实事求是的认知。如果你弱你还不承认，天天自我感觉良好，那你怎么会有提升的空间呢？你只会像印度这样一直烂下去。你以为一个国家10几亿人口，每个人都是那么的聪明，都知道其实自己国家是弱小的，现在只是在假装强大而已，是这样的吗？我看另一种更可怕的情况才是现实，那就是印度人假话说多了，结果10几亿阿三把他当真了，真以为自己非常的强，所以民族自信心、自豪感爆棚，到哪里都以为自己牛逼哄哄。所以呢，尽管你看这个学者他有很厉害的教育背景，可是骨子里始终摆脱不了印度人那独一无二的奇葩思维逻辑。而跟他对谈的这个印度主持人也是蛮搞笑的。他属于被忽悠的那10几亿人中的一个，虽然比一般的底层印度人认知高一点点，但也没高多少。他知道印度的硬实力是不如中国的，但居然以为印度的软实力比中国要强。所以当这个印度的专家告诉他印度软实力也不如中国时，而且接下来两者的差距会越拉越大，那这个主播很明显天塌了，破防了，看上去脸色很难看，心情很糟糕。从中呢，我们也能发现一点，那就是印度的精英阶层其实一直都是围绕着欧美在转的。这个印度专家，他的教育背景全都是在欧美，他看待中国是以西方的视角，把中印的关系定义为敌对的关系，而且他的结论是两国永远不可能和解。他的脑海中没有实事求是的概念，没有印度应该尊重事实，接受落后的现状，所以应该低调做人做事，主动的认怂，避开中国的锋芒，好好发展自己的思维。他的脑海中只有西方霸权主义的那一套，现在美国是霸主，下一个是中国，而再下一个就是印度。明明自己是个丫鬟命，却假装自己还是那个主角公主，天天做着霸权的美梦，把自己放在跟中美一样的位置上去思考看待全世界，实在是奇葩。而那个印度主播也同样如此，他以为印度人寄生于欧美世界，到处的繁殖，进入当地的政界商界，成为一股不可忽视的力量，就以此认为印度在全世界也有相当重要的影响力了。他的脑海中没有东西方之间的差别，以为西方就代表全世界，而这种思维逻辑放在当下的东升西降的大背景下，看起来是多么的愚蠢和无知。
But you make a very telling point about the asymmetry that exists in terms of soft power. Now, most Indians believe we are a great soft power. We believe it is our strength. But you say in your book, and this is the important thing, as a soft power, contrary to the generally held view, China betters India. Can you explain why you come to the conclusion that even as a soft power, China is ahead of India?
Yeah, so first of all, what is soft power? Just to be very clear, it's the power of attraction and therefore the power to persuade others. It's not coercive power, which is hard power, which is economic power and military power. So you can use economics to sanction people, you can use military power to beat people over the head and get them to do what you want. But soft power is, the power of attraction. People are attracted to you, and therefore it's easier to persuade them to do what you want them to do. It's very hard to measure. So, I say in the book, it is a bit tricky to make this assertion, but luckily the Australian Institute, the Lowy Institute, has done a pretty rigorous measurement of soft power components. And it looked at three components: foreign policy influence, cultural projection, and political values. And what that shows is, and take it for what it's worth, but what it shows is that on foreign policy influence, the feeling of outsiders or foreigners is that India simply doesn't show enough leadership. It's quite well networked in multilateral institutions, numbers of embassies and so on, stacks up quite well against the Chinese. But in terms of displaying leadership in these fora, there's a feeling that India simply isn't up to the game and doesn't exert itself enough. Secondly, the second component is culture. Now, I think we have a sense, and certainly I had it, that on that India did very well all over the world, whether it's our music or food and arts and literatures and so on and so forth, we do very well. But in fact, again, the Lowy Institute's measure, and I think there are other measures, show that on things like how we project our culture. So look at, for instance, the number of World Heritage Sites under UNESCO, the number of tourists that come to India, the number of foreign students that we host. I mean, these are just 3 or 4 quick measures. We're well behind the Chinese, especially on tourism. I mean, many years ago, I remember a student coming and telling me at JNU that India had as many hotel rooms as Bangkok city. Today, it's probably true that we have as many hotel rooms as Shanghai. So we moved up, but we're still really nowhere compared to the size of the sort of tourist infrastructure and the numbers we're welcoming. I think the Chinese welcome about 6 or 7 times the number of foreign tourists as we do. And the ratio is about the same for foreign students. So in projecting our culture, which is one way of attracting people to you and therefore then persuading them to do what you want them to do, I mean, I would say on those 2 measures, at least, India doesn't do well. We do somewhat better on political values. There's some regard for the democracy we have and for our pluralism and handling of dissent. But if you look at the figures in the Lowy Institute, the Chinese don't do too badly in terms of some measures of accountability and of governance efficiency as well. So, on political values, there's admiration for the Chinese. They get things done. Whereas there's some admiration for us on our pluralism and the liveliness of our democracy.
Yes, but the admiration for our pluralism, the liveliness of our democracy, and our tolerance of dissent may be moving in the other direction at the moment, but I won't get deflected by that. The first, I think, depressing thing you've said for an Indian audience is that China has a clear lead, and you've measured it very effectively in terms of soft power, but you go one step further. You say China's soft power lead looks set to persist for a good long time. So even in terms of soft power, where we think we have an edge, not only do we not, but it's quite possible that China will actually widen the gap and go further ahead.
Of course, that's a bit of a judgment call. It's not easy to project these things and to produce very hard figures. And you have to have a bit of an intuition about it. And I rely on having lived in Southeast Asia, particularly, or East Asia for the last decade and having traveled quite a bit in the region. But I think there are 3 or 4 reasons why I made the statement in the book. The first is, of course, economic power in China's phenomenal rise. So part of the soft power attraction is a kind of a sense of awe towards China, which I think India doesn't possess. So this is how some of these factors interact. The second reason, I think, is that, ironically, China's type sort of made a gesture towards this earlier. There's some admiration, particularly in Asia, towards this, partly because it helps China get things done quickly, At least that's the view. The second is, I mean, there are countries in the region that are not particularly democratic themselves and quite admire the way that China of the world, and not the democracy which is seen as noisy and chaotic and inefficient. I think the third reason is that China does a very good job of selling itself on TV and in the public sphere, the global public space. I don't know if you've ever watched CGTN, their outreach, their global television network. It's very, very slick. And with all respect to Indian TV networks, who I think were, in a sense, in the TV game much, much earlier, there's an enormous gap in sort of production values. And the way China uses its television, its films, its art and literature, the market for those products is booming. And India, for whatever reason, simply not getting that kind of cultural message out. On top of that, I think China, oddly enough, is a relatively accessible to foreigners. I mean, after all, we're talking about persuading and attracting foreigners, third parties to the two countries. I mean, it's very clear it's easier to get visas to visit China. The tourist facilities are fabulous. They have modern cities that, look like modular cities that everyone feels very comfortable in, at least the 8 or 10 leading ones compared to Indian cities. Things like sanitation, transportation, efficiency of its banking and other services. And even those who live longer in China, the expat life in the big cities, the employment potential. I mean, all these put together make it far more attractive to third parties than I think India is. So that's another reason. And lastly, of course, I would just say that reflecting on India, I mean, by contrast, we just do such a poor job of selling, let's say, for instance, our tourism. I have a Chinese friend who quite an admirer of India, and he used to say, I come to India, you have much more to showcase than China does for various reasons. A lot was destroyed in the civil war in China and in modernization, but your infrastructure is so poor. And you remain so insular, focused on domestic tourism. So I think there's certain reasons why, China just does better on soft power and looks to do so for quite a long time.